continued. 1947 is when we mark the beginning of, quote, the modern ufological era, because that's when Kenneth Arnold in Washington, east of the mountains, reported that what he saw were 9 silvery objects flying in a kind of skipping motion through the sky behind peaks and then out in front again. And when he landed, he said they skipped through the air like saucers, which good reporters reported as he said they were saucers. And then we had the word flying saucer, which came into our lexicon. He actually said they were heel-shaped with a straight edge and then a rounded edge. But it was reported flying saucers because he said they skipped through the air like saucers. There were other reports all over the country in small local newspapers of sightings of discs and cigar-shaped objects and other kinds of objects that were flying and incredible and seemed strange and didn't make sense to us in 46 and 47. And it compelled the attention of the military. So we have this memo from Lieutenant General Nathan Twining to a general, George Shogun. I want to underscore some words. He said, "It is the opinion that the phenomena reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious." Underscore real, not visionary, not fictitious. This is early on. They knew it was real. Why? Because not only people, but sensors like radar detected the objects in a consistent way, which showed consistent characteristics, and because credible people, as we'll hear in a minute, saw what they called incredible things. They knew it was real. That's the basis. The sociological puzzle and the psychological puzzle for the rest of the 20th century is how we humans can hear this being said in the 1940s. They are real, the general said. They are real, the general said. And it does not penetrate our brain, even drip, 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 in any meaningful way so as to become the cornerstone or a foundational anomaly that is a fact, which Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said is where you begin to change the paradigm. It has to be a fact and it has to be anomalous. That is, it cannot fit in our current model of understanding. It was anomalous, we didn't know what they were, and it was a fact. There are objects properly approximating the shape of a disk of such size as to appear to be as large as man-made aircraft. The reported operating characteristics, which are very important, extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action which must be considered evasive when sighted by aircraft and radar. It was serious and it was taken seriously. The aerodynamic capability of the objects was reported to be far in excess of anything that we knew how to do or could engineer, even though we may well have been working on trying to understand electromagnetic systems or propulsion systems that didn't just blow gas out of the back end of an object and push it forward in response with lift. They operated in a different way, and our observations confirm that, and we didn't know, and I don't think we still know exactly how gravity was displaced or electromagnetic currents were generated that affected space-time and affected the people who were close to the object in the way that they have been reported to do. So, they were real. Even Lyndon Johnson, who was a congressman then, he said, "What's the story? I'm getting letters from constituents who see these things." And he was told correctly, this is one half of the quote that's in the book, you get that I'm just skipping through the highlights of 600 pages of well-documented, complex, detailed history. We're investigating the flying discs. Detailed statements of credible witnesses are being carefully reviewed. Underscore credible witnesses. They knew then that's what they were, and they were being carefully reviewed, although not in public. Well, they had to respond, and they did. They formed Project Sign in 1948. There were 3 hypotheses considered by Project Sign, which was staffed by people who were well-intended and thought their commission, their task, was to try to come up with a hypothesis that best fit the data they were presented and said what these things were likely to be. And there were 3 major hypotheses. They were Russian, they were American, and a compartmented secret project that other people didn't know about or have a need to know about, or, as they thought, extraterrestrial. These days, people will say, well, maybe they're from another universe or another dimension, and some of the behaviors, well, I won't go into that. This talk isn't about their behaviors. But today we would expand on that and say, there are a variety of possibilities that might explain this if they are intelligent and if they are visitors. But at that time, it was Russian or American or extraterrestrial. Well, the Russians were not overflying our cities and our missile bases and our airports. They really weren't. They couldn't. They would have been in big trouble had they done that. If it was an American project, well, let's flash forward a few decades when Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, who walked on the moon, said to me, with a very straight face, Richard, he said, if we could do what they can do, they would not have sent me to the moon in a Tin Lizzie. Now, this is a man who spent several days cramped up in a tin can, going to the moon, walking on the moon, and who coming back had a life-changing experience in which he determined, perceived, experienced the unity of all things, the interconnectedness, the non-local connectedness and consciousness of all things, and he's devoted his life ever after to trying to articulate that so people could, very frustrating, very lonely, so people could understand what he experienced when he saw the unity of all things like a mystic coming back from the moon. They wouldn't have sent me to the moon in a Tin Lizzie if we knew how to move like that, he said. So it was determined that they were not American, to make the story very short. It was not a compartmented project, and we did not have the technological ability to do that. So the third hypothesis was the most likely, the least unlikely hypothesis that explains what we are looking at as data and evidence is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They wrote an estimate of the situation, which is what you did in that domain, and sent it up the chain of command to Hoyt Vandenberg, the general at the top. He responded appropriately by saying, I refuse to accept that. Knocked it back down. It went back down the chain of command. Project Sign was disbanded, but they had to do something more, so they did Project Grudge, the name of which signifies the attitude of the people in it, who now knew clearly, because when your commanding officer says, I refuse to accept the likely hypothesis that explains the data, then you know your task is to come up with a hypothesis that is probably much less accurate than that, and therefore just spin your wheels, kill time, have lunch, take long naps, and come up with something. Well, we don't have the estimate of the situation. There is one copy. It's kind of like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's hidden in a warehouse somewhere. But we do have the report of Ruppelt, Captain Ruppelt, who was one of the first head of Project Blue Book later on, that it existed and what was in it. And it was that hypothesis, and that's what was rejected. Well, Project Grudge had a different attitude, and they came up with this. Look at this press release. Evaluate it for yourself. We have investigated and evaluated blank, that is, whatever is reported to be occurring, and have found nothing of value which would change our previous estimates on the subject. You know, and we had memo machines then, not digital. So you crank out this press release, distribute them to all people and bases, and when anyone reports anything like an unidentified flying object, fill in the blank with the name of the incident and say it's been investigated and it's nothing. That was just an expedient response. Some were unhappy, like General Cable. He said, what the hell do I have to do? Actually, he said, what do I have to do to stir up action? Anyone can see we do not have a satisfactory answer to the saucer question. I want an answer, and I want a good answer. In other words, the government is not just one thing. There were people who looked at the data and knew it was real and not fictitious and had read the data and wanted an answer. And of course, the problem was that they didn't have an answer. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it was doing or doing here. And above all, this is critical, they wanted to know if it was a threat. Because if it was a Russian thing, it was a threat. Well, it wasn't Russian, but is it invaders from Mars? Are they going to eat us? Is it Klaatu come down to tell us to get rid of our nuclear weapons? Going to stop the roller coaster from going for 20 minutes to get the attention of Earth? It's not doing any of those things. What kind of a threat to our national security might this be? Post-World War II, Europe is in rubble. The Marshall Plan is being cranked up as a way to reconstitute Europe. You guys are kids and don't remember that Europe was destroyed by World War II. It was like Syria today. And the Russians were cranking up the Cold War. We were engaged in a new kind of battle. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, et cetera, et cetera. In the light of those concerns and the paranoia and anti-communistic, not just paranoia, but realistic concerns that we had in those years, whether or not an aerial phenomena of this sort was a threat was a very important thing, and it was primarily what they looked at. What is the national security evaluation of this phenomena and these incidents? Well, some still claim they were a mirage, but let's flash forward again, skipping ahead, 1952, a significant year. Do you fire on a mirage? Do you fire on a hallucination? Quote, we have quotes around and footnotes and documentation for every damn thing in the book. There is nothing speculative. It's from the government's own documents that for 50 years this dedicated, one would say obsessive, compulsive team. And do you know anyone who's interesting who's not obsessive? Certainly not in this con, right? 52, at a distance of 130 miles, the quote goes, northeast of Washington, D.C., relevant. In a minute, 3 different Army radar units detected an object at 18,000 feet. Strong signal, not an inversion, not a bogey, not a blip that wasn't explained. It remained stationary on radar for 30 minutes and then began to move, and by the time it reached the end of the scope, as I alluded, it was going 1,000 miles an hour. Our report went all the way to the Pentagon, and the order came back. If another came in, fire on it. After that first night, we loaded our 99mm anti-aircraft guns. Unusual to do in a populated area. You don't hear them going off over Nellis right now or over downtown Las Vegas or the Strip. We don't fire those kind of guns over populated areas at nothing. We scrambled F-94 jet fighters from McGuire Air Force Base. They didn't see them again. They didn't fire. But they were ready to engage in combat, not with a fictitious object, but with a threatening object, because it invaded the airspace which the Air Force was commissioned to protect and defend on behalf of the American people. And it had a lot of investment in having done so during World War II to an extraordinary degree. So this was really a threat and a challenge to everything, to groupthink, to ego, to institutional mentality, everything legitimate and maybe not as legitimate as well. But I said that was June 1952. In July, Washington, D.C., very famous in the cycle. 8 days over Washington, D.C., so many objects appeared so often, they were seen by multiple pilots, they were seen by multiple witnesses on the ground, and they were tracked by the air traffic control stations on radar in multiple ways. So multiple witnesses, all correlated to the same points and the same objects, and fighters were scrambled and chased them and couldn't catch them. Except one poor guy who was chasing one, and then instead of fleeing as they do, they just play cat and mouse, it came back toward him. And when he looked around, another one was coming back toward him from this side, another here. And when you look at the radar screen that is replicated by the transmission, by the transcript of the conversation with the air traffic controller, you see his blip here, and you see a circle of closing blips around him. And he said the equivalent of, holy smokes. What? How do I get out of here? Well, they, if there was a they, something heard it too, because then the blips parted. And there were multiple witnesses to this event. And General Samford said at a press conference before they decided the whole thing of 8 days duration was a inversion, a weather inversion, despite the contrary indications from meteorologists. He said credible people have seen incredible things. And it was news still, 52. That's the front page of the Washington Post. Can you imagine that today? The Washington Post, the New York Times, saucer outran jet, not pilot speculates, pilot hopes, pilot thinks, pilot reveals. He chased it, and it flew away so fast he couldn't catch it. I could show you numerous clippings. We have literally thousands of clippings that we have painstakingly gathered from around the country, from old periodicals as well as other archives, that in this case, there are many about this week. New York Times, other papers carried it as news because an investigation had to be on in secret after the chase over the Capitol. So it was news, and it was big news, and that was important. So they had to do something in response to this. They created Project Blue Book. These things were over the Capitol. They were over the White House. They didn't land at the White House, but they were over the White House. And they hired Dr. Alan Hynek from Northwestern University, famous astronomer, to be the resource for Project Blue Book. And the CIA got involved and concluded a study. Listen to these words carefully, because they signify what we document in greater complexity and detail, a direction that subsequently was followed after the Robertson panel convened Air Force and CIA people in 1953, and decided on a plan of response that made sense to them, and it kind of went aligned with this. Flying saucers are not a threat to national security. They didn't say they're not real. They said they're not attacking, they're not a threat, they fly around. What is a threat to national security? Reports of flying saucers are. Therefore, military personnel should be trained in proper observation of flying saucers. Now, at this point, we can speculate